should get your little red button coming up. And that's it. Okay.
Brilliant. Well, good evening to everybody. It's amazing to have so many of you here, which I think shows how much of interest the NPPF consultation is, which is good because it's quite a technical one, but obviously with some crucial stuff in it. So we're going to talk for, well, the webinar is about an hour. We've got me talking about the consultation and what's important. We've got a new bonus speaker who got in touch, and it's Gareth Capner. We're very grateful to getting in touch. He's a planning consultant who was previously a senior partner with Barton Wilmore. He's chairman of the Housing Design Awards, so he's got a keen interest on what makes good design. And he is working pro bono for a couple of groups at the moment, so he's going to do a little slot in the middle of, or towards the end of my section. We've then got Caroline Dibden, who's a CPA officer, and she's going to look at what the development sector and other people are saying about the NPPF consultation and changes. And then we're very grateful to have Catriona Riddell as our guest speaker. And I don't think probably anyone knows more than Catriona about strategic planning than Catriona does. And she's probably not going to argue with that, but she was previously specifically Director of Planning at the South East England Regional Assembly and writes regularly in the press about why strategic planning is good for communities. So she will talk about that. And we will leave all the questions to the end, but do put them into the chat as we're going through, and we might be able to answer some on the way through. So any of the speakers can try and answer, and then we'll have a session at the end. So about the consultation. It's quite a complicated one to get your head around and how best to approach it and how to answer it, because it's kind of doing 2 or 3 different things. So if you want to find it, you search Google for NPPF consultation 2023, and then you get to 2 documents. One is the sort of summary, the brochure prospectus about what the changes mean, and the other is the draft text for consultations. So that's the kind of actual changes to the text that are current, and the end date is the 2nd of March. The government sets out the background that, as you probably all know, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill is currently before Parliament, and government tells us that it's aiming for a fully plan-led system. It wants a stronger voice for communities. It's going to look at community infrastructure provision by developers and improving that, setting clear design standards that reflect community views. You can see there's quite a lot about community here, and enhanced protections for our precious environmental and heritage assets. So all good stuff there, and I don't think anyone could be unhappy with what it's intending to do or what they say it's intending to do. Government also tells us that we need further changes to national policy and guidance and regulations, and wider support for local authorities, communities and applicants. That's quite general, but that is why we've got this current consultation. The topics of the consultation are the updates to the NPPF, some more information and questions on the National Development Management policies, policy to support levelling up, and how the planning policy is accessed by users. And they say there'll be a further consultation, a fuller review of the framework in due course. So this is a kind of a preamble asking some good questions, actually, and obviously it's important to answer those questions to change the direction of what's coming in the future. So this is very wordy. I don't expect you to read it, but I can circulate these afterwards and it'll be on YouTube, so you can freeze it if you need to. What I've tried to do, because as I say, it's a really complicated consultation to answer. I think off the top of my head, there are 58 specific questions. Those questions jump around between the new text in the NPPF and the prospectus, and to an extent the Levelling Up bill. So it's quite hard to sort of pick out the important bits because it's a bit all over the place. So what I think I've put on this page down the left are probably the 4 most important topics that are covered, and then a little bit about each. So I will whiz through them without hopefully bogging you down in detail. So the first topic is housing targets, and probably you're all very familiar with some changes there. There's been a lot of press about it, and actually I don't think probably the press coverage is quite warranted. The changes are not as extreme are made out, because actually the standard method for determining housing need always was, wasn't advisory, that's the new word they use, but it was always just a starting point and you didn't have to stick to it. So authorities could choose a different local plan target if they wish to. And now it's advisory, so there's a bit more flexibility. The very bad news is that firstly, we're still required to use the standard method, and secondly, the housing projections that fell into that standard method are still very out of date. They're still based on 2014. So I'm just going to flick through to a slide that shows what that means. The top bar, so on the left you've got England, on the right you've got Wales, and the top bar is the actual census household, and then the bottom bar is the 2014 projections. So you can see what difference it makes. So basically we're planning using 2014 projections for a scenario that's completely different and doesn't reflect reality. And that's also backed up by the latest ONS projections, which show that the projected UK population to 2045 has actually dropped even since 2018. So there's a downward trend on population growth. There's not a the population isn't dropping, but the growth is slowing. And I'm going to not talk any more about that because Gareth's going to cover that in a minute. I've put here that development industry is hysterical about this because they seem to think it will stop house building. I don't agree, and I think the reason a number of plans are currently paused is more about the uncertainty than necessarily about reducing the housing targets and the numbers. So our comment here is we suggest you support the new advisory wording strongly in responses, but very much urge the use of latest projections. On plan making, a very brief point is that one small word, justified, has been struck out, and a plan no longer needs to be an appropriate strategy or take into account alternatives, all be based on proper evidence. I find that extremely worrying because all those things to me are very sensible and they should be taken into account in a plan. So I'm arguing plans must be justified and that word needs to be put back in. I know from a little exchange by email with Catriona before this that she has a slightly different slant on this, and I agree with much of what she's saying, but I think probably it's how we make sure the plan does all that it's supposed to, which is the key thing. Duty to cooperate has been removed. It didn't particularly work. It does leave a vacuum, but I'm going to leave that for Catriona to talk about. The presumption, the dreaded presumption, paragraph 11, lots of what look like small changes here, but actually are very significant. So there will no longer be a 5-year supply issue if your plan is up to date. There are no longer any buffers. You have to review the 5-year supply when it's 5 years old. A very interesting one is that past over delivery of housing now counts, which is great, particularly for councils around me which have over delivered, and it's always been a bit of a nightmare because that hasn't counted in our favour. You will be able to argue that a development is out of character with the local densities, and I think that's a slightly strange one, and I suspect that is in there because of Theresa Villiers' issues with very, very high tower blocks in suburban areas. So I think that higher density can be a very good thing. It's one of my bugbears actually, that we need to have more higher density, but I think that's in there for a slightly odd reason. Then there's this new presumption switch off, it's called, where if you have 115% planning permissions, the presumption no longer counts against you. A few little, well, it's not a little detail, actually. The urban uplift remains. That's the arbitrary uplift that 20 or so urban areas have been told they have to apply to their housing number, which it's a bit mad because they probably can't meet it. So not quite sure there's any use to that. So our comment is very good news, all these changes to the presumption, because it's weakened, and we see that as a good thing because it will help councils to have some breathing space to plan rather than constantly planning by appeal and fighting off speculative developer applications. So as far as I'm concerned, the presumption has always been a dreadful paragraph, and I've seen locally how it's caused huge problems. So anything that changes that is good. Then finally, on these key topics, effective use of land, density must be optimised, which is good because density brings huge benefits such as reducing the land use taken for development, creating more capacity for public transport and services. So it's a good thing. However, they've only said this must be in the top 20 cities, which is not good enough. It needs to be everywhere and it needs to be mandated through design codes, which is a good thing. A bad thing is that farmland is only mentioned in a footnote, so it's good it's now mentioned, but we feel that needs to be in the main NPPF and that best and most versatile farmland should be avoided for planning. Then there's the slightly odd bit about mansard roofs, which has snuck in there, which is fairly meaningless detail in the bigger picture. So those already. Again, I'm not going to talk you through this because you'll be able to see this in the slides if you need to. These are other few key bits that we should maybe think about when we respond. It's good that brownfield first in the top 20 cities, the biggest 20 cities, but we think it should be brownfield first everywhere where appropriate, unless it's rewilded and has high biodiversity value. Those final bullet points, the NPPF, the new consultation, is also going to look at ancient woodland protections review, how local authorities can best do a carbon impact assessment for local plans, which is a very interesting one and very important. There's a question about that. A new section on the importance of energy efficiency and adaptation of buildings, which is a good thing. And good old national development management policies, which have been quite divisive. And a lot of people think this is a power grab by government, which is, in my view, not necessarily the case. Its intention, government says, is to save plan makers from repeating nationally important policies. And I know a few of us, I know Caroline and I have talked about this. In my mind, it's a really good thing to have much more consistency in policy, because when I've sat looking through local plans and the wording of them and argued them at local plan examination, it's been really frustrating thinking, why is this being written separately when there's an NPPF that could apply to it? So I do think that there should be some very nice national central guidance to save local authorities writing a plan completely from scratch. But I also do agree with people like the CPRE that local authorities should be able to go above and beyond what is in a national development management policy. So it shouldn't be set in stone. They should be able to do better where they wish to. So in summary, how we think you should respond. We think it's very important to have a united front when we can on the key issues, obviously, if you agree with us. So I would say that we do welcome the overall shift in emphasis towards communities, but we would like much more of this. It's very important that communities are engaged very early on. I think there were 121 mentions of the word community or communities in the prospectus that accompanies the NPPF. So the government have listened to that, and it's really kind of how they apply that in reality that matters. Housing targets, we welcome the use of advisory and we urge up-to-date projections, and we strongly welcome the changes to paragraph 11 and 5-year supply. And in a minute, Gareth is going to talk about that. We are concerned about the removal of justified in plan making. We feel it must be reinstated, although perhaps with sensible evidence, as Catriona will probably talk about. We welcome the mentions of brownfield, farmland, climate and density, but we need more, such as brownfield first policy, protection for best and most versatile land in policy, not a footnote. We think it's great that carbon impact assessments are needed for local plans, and we'd like to see gentle or Goldilocks density first. That's my little catchphrase. And for the environment, the 6 focus areas must be clearly set out in national development management policies and in the NPPF and linked to government's announcement last week. So that's a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to hand over to Gareth to talk about, I think, bullet points 2 and 3 there, which is a sort of quite technical planning area. Thank you, Gareth. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I haven't. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Thanks, Rosie. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. As I would expect, all what you've said is completely on the nail. I have been, on behalf of the Whitchurch Town Council and the Whitchurch Conservation Group, majoring on the NPPF amendments, the second set of documents, because as I understand it, those amendments to the NPPF are the things that are going to happen quickly and are going to be related to the Levelling Up Bill, and are the amendments that are supposedly to assuage the concerns of the 100 rebel MPs. As Rosie said, I'm going to just talk briefly about bullets 2 and 3, housing targets. I absolutely welcome her point about, your point about up-to-date projections. The 2014 projections are 9 years old, and they're based on 14-year-old estimated data, some of which predates the 2011 census. So it is quite clear that those projections are out of date. The fantastic slide that you put up earlier shows that the projections were projecting a household population in 2021, where we are now, of nearly a million households more than actually are in existence in England. So the base of 2021 is wrong, let alone the future projection up to 2030s. So these projections are demonstrably out of date and wrong. But they are going to be sorted out by 2024, 2025 by a new set of projections. The second element of the standard method, which by the way should be called the Standard Housing Assessment Method, which has the very neat acronym of SHAM, the second element is called the affordability element. And that is based on an algorithm which assumes that if you build a few more houses, if you have another estate on the edge of your community, suddenly house prices are going to drop. And we all know that house prices are related to the availability and cost of credit. See what's happened over the last 5 months. In Basingstoke, any new housing estate is actually more expensive than the existing housing stock because there's a thing called the new homes premium. They're full of up-to-date kit. So to suggest that building 0.2% extra houses on the housing stock of England, there's 26 million houses in England, that the market is being determined by 2.2% and the 99.8% of existing stock is somehow affected is illiterate economically. And I just want to say to you that the affordability ratio is the hand grenade that you need to address in your representations. Said enough on item 2. Item 3. First of all, yes, we welcome those changes. First of all, we need to count all permissions. In Basingstoke, they only count permissions above 10. We're trying to get them to agree that you count permissions above 5. But you ought to count all permissions that actually add to the net housing stock. And then the other thing is I draw your attention to is footnote 9 in the NPPF amendments, which say that there is no tilted balance, the presumption in favour of development, if you meet your 3-year housing test. So I would ask you to look very closely. I'd be very also interested in Catriona's views. But the second part of that footnote says to me that even if you apparently don't have 5 years land supply, if you have met your housing targets over the last 3 years, then the tilted balance presumption in favour of development does not apply. And we need to ensure that the government adopt that in the final representations. Thank you. Is that okay? I can't hear you.
Rosie, are you there?
Rosie, you're on mute.
Maybe someone must have muted me. Sorry, I didn't realise.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That was brilliant. That was a great summary. And I'm very glad you agree with us. That helps as well. And hopefully everyone will find that useful. So, Caroline, over to you. Shall I reshare? And I'm sharing. Sorry, it's just. Can you see that?
Yes, but not as a slideshow. Perfect. Just run through the first one. Thank you. Great. Rosie asked me to have a look at what everybody was saying about the proposals. Obviously, as well as us. We're telling you what we think, but what is everybody else saying? So I sort of divided it up into various groups of sort of interested parties. Starting off with the developers and their groups, and then looking at some planners, some of the planning press and non-planning press. Consultants. I'm afraid there's a pile of money there. That is no way to reflect anything about brown envelopes. It is just to reflect that they do make money out of planning. I didn't dare put money next to the lawyers, so they've got a little gavel. Politicians, councils and planning authorities, and then some very angry people out there on Twitter and Facebook. So we thought we'd just take a quick look at what they said. Can you move the slide on, Rosie? Okay, so developers. There are obviously a lot of developers. There are the 6 very big ones that we know about: Persimmon, Barratt's, Bovis, etc. So I thought I'd take a look at their organisations. So British Property Federation says, it seemed like a missed operation to overhaul the system, increase resources for our local authorities and support growth. Well, I don't think anyone can disagree with that, actually. You know, everybody wants increased resources for local authorities because they are at the cutting edge of trying to achieve all of this change. But they've also said changes to the housing targets will see fewer houses delivered and some areas of the country unable to meet their population growth. Well, as Gareth has just said, I don't think that that actually will turn out to be the case, because the population growth is actually, if you like, an unreal target. The House Builders Federation. House Builders members share frustration with the planning process, which many will agree is in the worst state it's ever been. And then a rather nasty little comment: an already miserable situation has been worsened considerably by the government's concessions to the NIMBY-leaning faction of Conservative backbench MPs. And we're going to see the word NIMBY coming up in a few comments from people over the next few slides. The Land Promoters and Developers Federation, which is a group of exactly what it says on the tin. It's going to lead to poorer quality local plans. Plans don't meet the need to build homes to house the families that cannot get on the ladder. Plans that do not allocate the land. This one was really going quite far. The UK's worsening housing crisis is becoming an unintended contraceptive. The idea being that because households can't form, they will also choose not to have children. But that isn't why population growth is slowing, not because they are choosing not to have fewer children. The UK's worsening housing, the current planning reforms will lead to less housing delivery in those areas of the country have the most acute affordability issues, which brings us back to that affordability party of the equation. It's not real need, it's just an equation. Rosie, the next one. So the planners and the planning press. Well, the RTPI, which is the Royal Town Planning Institute, says it's a welcome opportunity for planners to inform how the government's planning reforms intend to deliver levelling up. A very rational statement, one I totally agree with. The Town and Country Planning Association, it's a missed opportunity to take action on climate change, health and well-being. Again, very rational. And they put forward some proposals along with the RTPI, I think, for how net zero could be incorporated, which it actually wasn't. There were some words, but not much more than that. Housing Today, well, then they had some articles. Fears raised over NPPF reform. Planning overhaul will merely entrench no development status quo. It fails to provide an adequate supply of homes. And then the rider, we need a lot of new homes, 6 million of them apparently. So we'll go from the mid-20s to over 32 million homes is what they're asking for. Planning Resource, which is the has a lot of articles, says 39 things you need to know about the government's NPPF consultation. You'll be glad I'm not going to give you all 39. But it does say the proposed national policy changes weaken the link between the government's local housing need figures and council's local plan homes targets, which is likely to see the latter figure decrease. They keep coming back to the fact that these targets might not be reached, but don't ever challenge the fact that the targets are actually just targets. They might not necessarily be needed if you change the equation that created them in the first place. Rosie, next slide, please. Well, the non-planning press, we've got the Daily Express, you can always rely on for a headline. The countryside is under siege in a rush for homes. Well, in some places that might well be true. The Guardian, new homes at risk as English local authorities cut house building plans. So they're picking up on the house building numbers again. And then the Times, as usual, Tory NIMBYs want to scrap housing targets. It's selfish, wicked, and must be stopped. And NIMBYs are the real reasons your children can't buy a house. Two individuals who are firmly of the belief that the only thing stopping housing is, in their case, is people like Rosie, I'm afraid, who got a personal nod in one of those articles. Next one, Rosie. So the consultants, well, they do make money from people building houses. So I suppose we shouldn't be surprised when they say These are some of the big ones. Oh, and I think Gareth, Barton Wilmore's got a little nod there at the bottom. Lichfield's local authorities have been putting off their local plans. It's likely to put the brakes on. It'll only set a requirement to deliver sufficient homes as far as possible. If it passes, they will significantly reduce the number of homes being delivered. Turley's more authorities are likely to pause, halt and review their existing draft plans. We'll see paralysis in Greenbelt authorities. Savills, we're likely to see emerging local plan housing requirements in Greenbelt areas significantly below identified housing need. And then coming to Barton Wilmore, now known as Standec, the lack of a method for cross-border cooperation is a big problem, and Catriona will talk about that. You'll be in a situation where Authority A says we're the most beautiful area in the country and can't possibly accommodate a single extra home, and Authority B says exactly the same, and then you're stuck. The upshot is a dramatic watering down of the existing 5-year land supply. So they're all coming out with quite extreme comments on what actually seems to be only a minor change in some cases. Rosie, next one. Well, the lawyers, Mary Cooker from Town Legal, a very sensible thing. Any attempt to move away from the standard method and use a lower figure will still require exceptional circumstances, as currently is already required. Frith saying the strengthening of Greenbelt policy will be a political green light to plan for below required needs, and the proposed changes will exacerbate existing uncertainty and delays in plan making. And Chris Young, who is a Casey at number 5, who is almost messianic in his belief that we need to build 300,000 homes a year, and has actually got 10 full pages of articles on his LinkedIn profile. And headlines, Tories abandon housing targets and turn their back on home ownerships. And he's actually come up along with one of the consultants of 59 Tory MPs that can be targeted for campaigning against on this basis at the next election. Says the proposed changes are wrong and misguided. The government's move to abandon housing targets and make them only advisory is nothing short of calamitous. So that he's quite an influential barrister, and we should take seriously what he is saying, even if we don't happen to agree with it. Rosie, next. Politicians, well, the commentator who named Rosie in the Sunday Times is works for the CPS, which is a think tank, and they had come up with a case for house building, and they had got some quite influential Conservative MPs to support them, namely those on the left, Sajid Javid and Simon Clarke, who was who was in housing for about 4 minutes earlier this year. Whereas sensibly, the Local Government Association has said that the move to make the standard method an advisory starting point is not significant, as it had always been a starting point for the calculation of local housing targets. So that's what the professionals are saying. I just took a random councillor from Nailsea in Somerset, and he's worried that he says his town in North Somerset has a population of 15,000, but new housing development will take that to 20,000. But there are no proposals or money for new schools, health centres or road infrastructure, all of which are already stretched. And I'm sure there are quite a lot of you in the audience who feel exactly the same way. Meanwhile, the UK Parliament, they have got a committee that is going to examine the changes and how this might affect local housing need and local plans. And we will watch that committee as it goes through. Rosie, next one. Right, and there are some very, very angry people out there. Again, a field guide to the NIMBYs of the British Isles. Priced Out, who are a rather opaque organisation who, again, sole remit is to encourage house building and seem to think that it is just people and local groups who are stopping them, which seems to me to be an extraordinary thing because we very rarely do manage to actually stop anything. Tom Harwood, who is a so-called journalist who works for GB News, who just does a Twitter poll, build millions of houses or have a national decline. Those are your only two options. Rather simplistic. Yimby Chris, who is really an angry person who just thinks that NIMBYs are gaslighting with their faux support of development while simultaneously opposing a scheme is the chef's kiss of hypocrisy. So he's out there. There are a lot of people out there, and he advises the Labour Party. So this is a cross-party attack on people who care about the countryside and housing and want to actually build what is needed, not just what will support all these groups. And a guy called Anthony Breach, who works for the Centre for Cities, who thinks that we have a terrible, terrible planning system just because people get to vote about it and that councillors get to think about it, and it would be far better to have no planning at all. Rosie, final slide. But he is not nearly even as extreme as Freddie Poser of Priced Out, who basically says not only should we not have any changes to the planning system, we just shouldn't have any planning at all, because that is the only way that we're ever going to get anything built. Because look at what these planners have been doing all these years. And I think his final words, they have played us for absolute fools. It's a bit depressing, really, for all the people who are professionals doing their best to come up with placemaking and build houses that people actually need. Thanks very much, Rosie. That's me done with a brief run through of everybody's thoughts about it.
Thank you. That was brilliant, very enjoyable as well. And yes, obviously recognise many of those characters on Twitter and LinkedIn. So it's good to see some balance within there as well. Okay, so over to Catriona, and probably I know we gave you a brief to talk about duty to cooperate and why strategic planning is good for communities, but I'm sure you've also got some comments to make on what you just heard earlier as well. So over to you. I'm going to stop sharing as well.
Thank you. That was a great run through, and there's nothing in there that I would disagree with. There's a lot to digest in the planning reforms, and as you say, a lot of it coming forward sooner rather than later, and then a lot of questions about what to do later, whether we ever see the light of day of these, given that there's probably going to be a general election sometime in between then as well. Who knows? So yeah, it feels a little bit like treading water as a planner. My day job is although I'm a strategic planner, a lot of the work I do is working with local authorities on their local plans, and I haven't seen a sort of down tools like this since sort of 2010. It's quite a depressing place to be, and I think you're right, it's not necessarily to rethink plans and things. I think it's just a huge amount of uncertainty, and the last thing a lot of local planning authorities want to do is move forward with a plan that doesn't tick the boxes, and they have to go back to the start again. So it's a lot of money to do a local plan. So it's a very uncertain time, and we've been living with it for a while. So strategic planning is my bag, as Rosie said. I have done, oh gosh, every year it feels like 50 years, but since I started my life in 1990, and yes, I remember Gareth very well in South East Plan days and Barton Wilmore days, and I was head of strategic planning at Surrey County Council, and then I was I was director of planning at the South East Regional Assembly, so it's very much in my blood. But for me, strategic planning only works if it works alongside local planning and neighbourhood planning. For me, it has to, you have to have the full spectrum of planning. Planning works and operates at different levels, and there's a lot of debate about, is strategic planning regional planning? My view is, and I use the Goldilocks phrase as well, Rosie, because for me, strategic planning is best if the Goldilocks principle in terms of scale. It has to be big enough to be able to implement national policies, but it has to be local enough to be able to reflect local circumstances. So you have to try and fit it at that level. But nonetheless, we've had nearly half a century of regional planning in some form and of strategic planning in some form. So there was a lot there, a lot of good in it. We have a lot of experience in terms of strategic planning, and we did do it quite well in different ways until 2010. So what is strategic planning? And I get asked this all the time. It's not a big local plan. It really isn't a big local plan. For me, strategic planning is about a sort of strategic investment framework more than anything else. It does two main things. The first one is it offers a bigger canvas on which to look at growth and to look at development and to offer better choices. Since 2012, everybody's had to look inwards to deliver the housing they need and to deal with the growth that they've had to do, and that has proved really challenging for a lot of areas for good reasons. Strategic planning offers that bigger spatial canvas because it means you can look at areas that have got opportunities, but also look at areas where there are significant constraints and make, it offers more choice. The second thing is that it is there to align long-term spatial priorities with infrastructure, with environment, with economic, with social, with all these different things that you have to look at in terms of places. So it's looking at bringing these all together and aligning them, and really importantly, it's about looking at it from a sort of forward planning right through to delivery, and that includes aligning the investment decisions and the funding. And one of the things we've really suffered from since 2012 is fragmentation of decision making, fragmentation of funding. Everybody's using their little pots, and we aren't maximising the potential of that money to really focus on the right infrastructure in the right places. So these are the two sort of main roles of strategic planning. And it really matters because I think particularly now, we don't have a system that allows choices that actually tries to deliver sustainable growth or sustainable development in the right places. And a lot of local authorities have tried to do that despite the system in the last 12 years, not really because of it. And you will be familiar with your own patch. Many have failed in their attempts, West of England, Oxfordshire, South Essex, to name just a few. There's, Greater Manchester has been the one that's been moving forward. It is still teetering on the edge. It's maybe at examination, but it's not home and dry yet. A lot of the debates are around housing distribution. There are always winners and losers in the numbers game. And there is a lot around Greenbelt, inevitably. If you've got an effective strategic planning system, not everybody has to look at the Greenbelt. If you've got an effective strategic planning system, you look at the Greenbelt strategically, which is what it is there to. It is a strategic tool. You're supposed to look at it at that level and decide where, if it needs changed, identify where it needs changed. So in the old South East Plan days, for example, we looked at reviewing around Guildford and some other places, but not every local authority had to review the Greenbelt at that point. It was very much targeted at the areas that were going to get the investment as well. So we had it for 50 odd years. It's gone, and we've been trying to get it back in some way. So we've had the duty to cooperate. And when we had the consultation in 2020, I think they received 44,000 responses. And from what I understand, a huge number of those responses supported getting rid of the duty to cooperate. It doesn't deliver good planning outcomes. It is a process-driven tool, but it also has some very harsh penalties if you fail. As we know, it's the only one at examination that can send a plan back to the start, and that is what government didn't like. They weren't really looking at it from it doesn't deliver good strategic planning outcomes. They just were looking at it from it's too much of a cost for local planning authorities if they fail it. And it can be quite arbitrary in terms of what an inspector looks at as well, in terms of the deciding whether they failed or not. So it's been revoked through the Levelling Up bill. And it will be replaced by what the government are calling a policy alignment test, which will be used by inspectors to look at strategic planning matters at a local plan examination. Now, the big problem we've got with this is that when an inspector looks at a local plan, they are only looking at, in most cases, they are only looking at that single local plan. And the whole point of the alignment test is to allow inspectors to fix a plan through modifications to allow it to progress to the end. Now, strategic planning matters by their very nature are cross-boundary. They impact on more than one local plan. So my question is, how can an inspector fix strategic planning failures if they're only looking at that one single local plan? Now, the only way they can do that is by testing a number of local plans at the same time. that requires them all to be running on similar timetables, which is very, very rare. You've also got some really big issues, strategic issues around water neutrality, nutrient neutrality, that cover quite large areas, and we're having some real challenges around that in terms of how you review them, all the local plans in these areas, when they're all running at different in different timescales. So you'll see the problem. Big, you know, I can understand the concern about it duty to cooperate derailing local plans, but this policy alignment test is going to be very problematical for inspectors, and I'm not sure how they're going to be able to test it. So the only other real choice that local authorities have is to go down the route of voluntary spatial development strategies. Now, these are new tools in the box that are being introduced through the Levelling Up Bill. We already have spatial development strategies for combined authorities, although currently there is only one combined authority doing that, and that's Liverpool City Region. They're managing to move forward because they've got an agreement that they will all meet their own needs. They've all got up-to-date local plans that can demonstrate that they can meet their needs. So they're focusing on some of the big issues around climate resilience, around health and well-being, and around strategic infrastructure. So they are moving forward, but they are the only one. Now, spatial development strategies are like, they will replace what we've been doing through joint strategic plans. And there was 5 joint strategic plans. There is only one, and that's in South West Hertfordshire. They are incredibly difficult to do, and spatial development strategies is going to be very interesting because government are asking the question around how can we incentivise these? You know, Oxfordshire had nearly £500 million worth of funding to pay for infrastructure, and it still fell apart. So how much do you need to do to encourage local authorities to work together on these new strategies, when again with strategic planning there is probably going to be winners and losers? So, you know, and it's too easy to walk away, frankly. So we've got some real problems. I will leave with one thought. One of the questions in the consultation I think is an interesting one, which is specifically what strategic planning mechanisms should be used to manage environmental issues. Now, that is from my discussion with Joanne Averley, the Chief Planner, that is very much around things like river catchment areas, nature recovery, nutrient neutrality, water supply, and everything else. The recognition that these are usually cross-boundary, cover a much larger area. And I think that's great. If that's all we've got, then great. My concern is, back to the very first point I was making, is that one of the whole purposes of strategic planning is joining the dots. It's a systems approach. It's to bring everything together. So if you separate the environmental issues out through a strategic planning mechanism, you lose that really strong purpose of doing it in the first place. So I will finish there.
Fabulous, thank you. That was really useful, because there's a lot of stuff in there that sort of gets a bit lost because it's hidden in the Levelling Up Bill as well as in the NPPF. And I completely agree with you. There's no joining the dots, is there, anywhere? And that common complaint you hear from communities that we saw on the quote that Caroline put in, the fact the infrastructure doesn't come, it's because there's never a plan for it. There's usually a sort of infrastructure delivery plan document that's held sort of in a file or in a safe or in a cellar by a local authority, and it's not delivered. And I think as well, in terms of incentivise people for growth plans, part of the problem is that government expects you to deliver uber growth to get any money. So you can't just sort of plan for what you've got going on in your area and for sensible growth. They expect to see above and beyond growth to give you the sort of 500 million that Oxfordshire got, don't they? So it's kind of a poison chalice, really. Anyway, that was very useful. Thank you. I'm going to now how to do the questions, because we've got a lot going on in here.
Yeah, I did open up a Q&A box, Rosie, and if people could put specific questions in there, but I know that at least one person can't see the Q&A area. So I'll just pick up on a couple of things, and maybe Caroline spotted some as well. But just a couple of questions or points raised about the transitional arrangements, and there are some specific questions in the NPPF guidance about consultation about those. And I think it's important we do answer those. The Save Greater Manchester's Greenbelt group, for example, is saying in our response that we feel that the authorities that have that are taking their plans through the process at the moment should be asked to do a review of what the implications are of the new guidance, and to implement those within a year of them being adopted. The reason for that is that if we do what's said in the transitional arrangement, we'll be at the end of this decade before some of these things actually are implemented in some local plans that are just going through the process at the moment. So I think it's worth having a look at those questions about the transitional arrangements and thinking about the issues that might need to be considered there.
Well, should we ask either Gareth or Catriona? I don't know if either of you wants to talk about that, because you're pretty closely involved with people. I mean, yeah, either of you particularly want to answer that?
I can have a go at the you're right. Transitional arrangements are really important, and local authorities have got until the end of June 2025 to get their plans through the current legal system. Those that are not at sort of a very advanced stage can benefit from the changes in the NPPF that they're proposing to take through this spring. So the tests of soundness, for example, the changes to the tests of soundness, they will apply to plans that have not yet reached the sort of final publication stage. But most local authorities who are preparing a plan at the moment are expected to get their plans in place by June 2025. We were previously looking at the end of this year for the deadline set by government. Any plans that haven't got to that stage, can't meet that deadline, or are just starting now, are expected to start looking at the new system. And that is, I'm working with a couple of authorities who are in that position. It's quite difficult because there's still so much uncertainty around, we've got a lot of things like a 30-month timetable for local plans. They're going to have what they call gateway checks in local plans, the new policy alignment test. So and we've got sort of environment, the replacement for sustainability appraisal coming forward, infrastructure plans, a whole load of things coming forward that there's no information yet on. So that's the sort of transitional arrangements. Greater Manchester, I think, is an interesting one because they are at examination. So unless one of their partners walk away, they will probably try and get that plan through the process. They have the option of withdrawing right up until the last minute, and you'll have some of you will remember Castle Point famously doing that last year. They pulled their plan, even though it was found sound. Literally just before they adopted it, they pulled the plan. So Greater Manchester, until they actually had all 10 partners, I think it's 10 partners, until they all
it's
adopt
9 now.
That plan. 9 now.
It's 9 now, and the planning inspector has asked the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to do a review of what the implications might be. So yeah, anyway, just to let you know, Rosie, Gareth has his hand up to come in. Yeah,
go on then, Gareth.
Well, just very quickly, I don't know anything about Greater Manchester, but there is a question, isn't there, in the NPPF consultation about whether there should be green belt releases, putting it simply. And we all know that the green belt is actually not about preserving some nice countryside. It's about urban containment, and so it's all about sustainable urban living. But it does provide certain costs because people then jump over the green belt and then make trip making into the urban area. I just think that the government's blanket approach, because the green belt is this totem that everybody understands it's no development, that this blanket approach is not necessarily a very good approach. The thing in my mind is the green belt stroke metropolitan open land round Heathrow. When I flew into Heathrow last week from Madeira, you could see the donkeys actually grazing in these paddocks next to our biggest hub, which is going to have a third runway sometime and is a massive economic driver. And why the authorities in West London don't get together, Hillingdon, Hounslow, some of the Surrey authorities, and say, right, we're going to have a defensible greenbelt boundary, not this fragmented greenbelt. We're going to take the greenbelt boundary to the M25. And what we're going to do, we're going to have a strategic study, and we're going to allow housing, employment, and open space, Colne Valley Regional Park, all that stuff. And we're going to have a pot of money so that people who are releasing land for open space actually get compensated from the people who get development value in housing or employment, warehousing, whatever. And I think I'm like Catriona, let's have some strategic planning. And if we had some strategic planning instead of this sort of totem, well, we're going to save the greenbelt because it's good for Tory voters, then I just think that people will start getting engaged in a proper debate. So, sorry, my just point is I'm really not in favour of this blanket approach in the NPPF saying we're going to keep all the greenbelt. I think it all depends on particular circumstances.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. There's a lot I agree with there, actually. I don't think a blanket approach to anything helps anyone ever. So, OK, thank you. Right, there's some hands up. Marge, can you work out who the hands are?
Yeah, we've had, well, people have to put the questions in the question area or the chat because they can't speak because their mics are off. So don't put your hand up if you're not a speaker. You can't speak in this call. We've had a couple of questions about whether any LPAs have successfully managed to argue that they deliver a lower number of houses than the standard method. Does anybody have any examples? Because it seems many people are concerned that even if the LPA puts it forward, the planning inspectors don't accept it. Even though it was advisory, it's now been confirmed it's advisory. So, yeah, anyway, that's one of the questions. Gareth has got his hand up, I think, to answer that, and Caroline too. Yeah.
Well, I'll defer to Caroline. She's more connected to this, but I believe there's one London borough because of the fact that it's London who manage this, but Catriona might have better data. But all I'm saying is that this is why don't think that this advisory approach to housing targets is going to let you off, because as Mary Cook says, Mary Cook KC, in your legal slide, it is still requires exceptional circumstances. So what we need to do is we need to get at the technical flaws and credibility of the standard method. That is the most important thing that all groups can be talking about. Not, oh, it's advisory, we're let off. No, frankly, it's still mandatory, really. And what you need to be doing is you need to be undermining it because it is out of date and it's got this flawed concept behind it. And that's what we're doing in Whitchurch. And that's what we basically, hopefully, got Basingstoke to agree to.
Okay, super. Caroline and then Catriona.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying in Hampshire to get lower housing targets for, well, Winchester, East Hampshire and the New Forest, which are significantly within national parks. And national parks, in theory, should be relieved of their obligation to meet market housing. But when you ask the local authorities to be brave and go to an examination and say 60% of your local authority is within a national park, so why do you think you've got to put 100% of your standard method required need into the 40% that's outside the national park? They suddenly don't get very brave, and they don't even dare try it with an inspector. So the fact that it has only been advisory hasn't actually very much been tested. I think Simon has said in the chat that Lewis did it with a lower target number, but I don't think it was very much lower. Whereas if you've got that proportion of your land mass within a national park, or indeed with the Greenbelt, then the ramifications for trying to squish the same number into the tiny kind of leftover part of the authority is where the problems happen. And then they try and shove it onto the next neighbouring authority, who shoves it onto the next neighbouring authority. Hence, I think why the duty to cooperate hasn't really worked either, because they have their own constraints. So if you try and push it out of what is a South Downs National Park, you come up against the Greenbelt at the other side, or the sea if you go the other way. So you can't push it much further. So it turns out it is very, very special circumstances required, and it hasn't actually really been tested.
Yeah.
Super. Okay, Catriona.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few councils that have, so I think somebody's put on the chat, Worthing very recently, I think last October, November, got their plan through with much less than 50% of the standard methodology. Their neighbours Brighton got through with 44%. Birmingham got through with about half. There's a number of councils that have successfully managed to argue their case, mostly very clear, obvious constraints. Elmbridge in Surrey is currently progressing a plan that is for 70% of their standard methodology and is not proposing to release any Greenbelt. They are making their view is their plan is fully policy compliant. I have read it. I agree. I've read I think they've made a very good case for protecting the Greenbelt in that particular area. It's strategic Greenbelt, most of it, and it is, it's a really good case. One distinction to make, and it's a really important one, there are two different ways to look at this. So Mary in that quote was talking about exceptional circumstances for using an alternative to the standard methodology. That is different to what local planning authorities generally look at in terms of this going below or above the standard methodology. And if I can explain it like this, to have exceptional circumstances in the NPPF to use an alternative to standard methodology means you're just not looking at the standard methodology. You are actually having a different assessment of needs. So Coventry, for example, and there'll be people on this call that were probably part of that legal challenge, argued that the demographics underpinning the standard methodology were so fundamentally flawed because of the situation they had with students that it made absolutely no sense to even use that as a starting point. So those that are talking about exceptional circumstances are talking about not using the standard methodology at all, even as a starting point. For most local authorities, they haven't got the case to argue about using an alternative. So their challenge or their role then is to look at the starting point and then look at all the other policies. And it's like a local plan. You should never pick out a policy on its own and isolate it. You have to look at the plan's policy framework as a whole. It's the same with the NPPF. So you start with the number and then you look at how you can fit it in. So there are places like Brighton that is and Leeds, I think, is Sheffield. They are all looking at capacity-based approach. So although they'll take the standard methodology as a starting point, they are also looking at different ways in which they can accommodate it or not. And they're also looking at sort of an urban capacity approach, but will probably significantly reduce their target. So when they talk about exceptional circumstances in the standard methodology, that is different to just using the standard methodology as a starting point and applying that other national policies. But there are a lot of local planning authorities currently going through the motions of looking at a much lower number than the standard method.
Super, that's useful to know. Gareth and Caroline, your hands are still up. Are they new hands, new points?
They are new points. Hopefully this sort of discussion illuminates generally for other people. It's not just me and Catriona or Caroline talking, but I agree absolutely with what Catriona said. So in Basingstoke, which I think is sort of a typical authority, yes, we've got AONB, yes, we've got protection areas, we've got river tests and all sorts of things. But basically, most of the authority is without protected designation, specific protected designation. There isn't any green belt, that important constraint. So the issue has to be for authorities like Basingstoke that you have to actually challenge the standard method. You have to challenge it technically because it's flawed, because it's not up to date, and it's flawed because it's economically illiterate. And that is why, up to the 2nd of March, most authorities and most people living in these areas need, I'm afraid, this is a bit of a stuck record, but this is the really important thing, because everything else, if that doesn't change and we get a proper, up-to-date, objective assessment of housing need, which is what, you know, the Town Council, the Whitchurch and the Conservation Group is in favour of, unless we get that proper, accurate, objective assessment of need, then everything else promised by Michael Gove is hogwash, because there is still going to be a huge push for your countryside to be developed.
Thank you. Which, depressingly, I agree with. And I've just put in the chat, we are over an hour, and this is super interesting, but we could go on for hours because there's lots of us and there's so much to cover. So I'm going to put one final question, probably to Catriona, which is, have any LPAs that you know of produced interim policy statements pending the outcome of the NPPF consultation? Or Gareth, if you know, or anyone, if you know of them, but I certainly haven't seen any.
Not that I am aware of. I think it's too early. You might start seeing them, but I've certainly not seen any, and I've not heard of any. Usually, I'm quite well connected, and people tell me, but I certainly haven't heard of any.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
agree.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much to our guest speakers, Catriona and to Gareth. It's been incredibly useful having you here because you've got so much expertise and knowledge and experience. And Caroline, thank you for your review of Who's Saying What, which was fascinating. And thank you to every single one of you who's attended and all the brilliant comments in the chat, which are really useful in their own right to find out what's going on, and for your questions. And it's being recorded, so it'll be on our YouTube channel. I did put a link earlier for people to sign up to get emails from us, so it'll be there. It'll be on our Facebook page and it'll be on Twitter. So as will the slides. So hopefully some of those methods you'll get the follow-up if you need it. So with no further ado, I'm going to say thank you very much and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.